Yesterday, I did something that no African leader has done in decades. I picked up the phone and told the most powerful man in the world exactly what I thought about his plan to destroy my people's future. That man was Donald Trump. And what I told him? It's about to change everything you think you know about how small nations deal with superpowers. But before I tell you what happened on that call, because trust me, it was explosive, you need to understand what was really at stake. This wasn't just about trade. This wasn't just about economics. This was about whether 22 million people would eat tomorrow, or whether they'd become refugees fleeing a continent that the world has already written off. My name is Ibrahim Traore. I'm 35 years old. I run Burkina Faso, and yesterday I declared war on the system that's been bleeding Africa dry for centuries. Stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you will explain why every intelligence agency in Washington is now watching my every move. 3 days ago, my economic advisors rushed into my office with news that made my blood run cold. The United States was about to impose a 30% tariff on everything we export to America. Not 5%, not 10%, 30%. To put that in perspective, that's not a trade adjustment. That's even have the courtesy to warn us first. We found out the same way everyone else did, through rumors, through leaked documents, through the whispers of diplomats who couldn't look us in the eye, as if 22 million people weren't worth a phone call before you destroy their economy. That's when I knew this wasn't about trade policy. This was about sending a message that Africa should know its place, that we should be grateful for whatever scraps fall from their table, that we should never, ever forget who's really in charge. They were wrong. Let me tell you something about the phone call that's got Washington talking. Because what happened in those 23 minutes wasn't diplomacy. It was a reckoning. When Trump's voice came through that secure line, I could hear it immediately. The tone you use when you're talking to someone you don't consider an equal, the casual dismissal, the assumption that I'd called to beg. He started talking about America's economic interests, about protecting American jobs, about how these tariffs were necessary for America's future. I let him finish. Then I said something that I guarantee no American president has heard from an African leader in decades. I said, "Mr. President, let me tell you about my economic interests." The line went quiet, and that's when I told him exactly what his 30% tariff would do to my people. But here's the part that really got his attention. Here's the part that made him realize he wasn't dealing with the kind of African leader he was used to. I told him about Sarah. Sarah is 23 years old. She works in a textile factory in Ouagadougou. She supports her mother, her 2 younger brothers, and her own infant daughter on the wages she makes sewing clothes that get shipped to American stores. When Trump's tariff hits, Sarah doesn't just lose her job, she loses everything. Her family goes hungry. Her daughter stops getting the medication she needs. Her brothers drop out of school to try to find work that doesn't exist. And Sarah becomes one of the millions of young Africans who start looking north, toward Libya, toward the Mediterranean, toward the boats that sometimes make it to Europe and sometimes don't. That's what a 30% tariff looks like in human terms. That's what America first means when you're on the wrong side of it. I told Trump all of this, and then I told him something that made him very, very quiet. I said, "Mr. President, you can destroy our textile industry today, but when 10 million young Africans start moving toward your allies in Europe because their economies collapsed, don't call me asking why your migration crisis just got 10 times worse." You see, here's what these people never seem to understand. When you destabilize African economies, you don't just hurt Africans. You create problems that end up on your doorstep, whether you want them there or not. But the real moment, the moment when I knew this call was going to change everything, came when Trump asked me something I wasn't expecting. He said, "What do you want?" Not, "What can we do to help?" Not, "How can we work together?" Just, "What do you want?" As if this was a negotiation. As if my people's survival was something I needed to bargain for. That's when I told him something that I don't think any African leader has ever said to an American president. I said, "I don't want anything from you, Mr. President. I want you to stop taking from us." The silence on that line lasted so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then he asked me to explain what I meant, and that's when I told him about the real cost of doing business with America. For every dollar of aid America gives Africa, African countries send back $5 in debt payments, resource extraction, and unfavorable trade terms. We're not being helped. We're being harvested. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, that everyone talks about like it's some great gift to Africa. It's designed to keep us exactly where we are. Suppliers of raw materials, buyers of finished goods, never competitors, never equals. But here's what really shocked him. Here's what made him realize that this wasn't going to be the conversation he was expecting. I told him I'd been studying his trade policies. All of them. not just the ones affecting Africa. I knew about the deals he'd made with China. I knew about the concessions he'd given to Europe. I knew about the exceptions he'd carved out for countries that had the power to fight back. And I asked him a simple question. Why do you think Africa deserves less respect than China? You want to know how Trump responded to that? He didn't. He changed the subject. Started talking about security cooperation, about counterterrorism, about how America helps keep Africa stable. That's when I told him something that really got his attention. I said, Mr. President, you want to talk about security? Let me tell you what real insecurity looks like. See, here's what they don't understand in Washington. The biggest security threat to Africa isn't terrorism, it's economic desperation. When young people can't find work, they don't just disappear, they join whatever organization promises them a future. Sometimes that's terrorist groups. Sometimes it's criminal networks. Sometimes it's migration routes that end in tragedy. But all of these problems start with the same thing, an economy that can't provide for its people. So when America imposes tariffs that destroy African jobs, they're not just hurting our economy. They're creating the exact conditions that breed the instability they claim to be fighting. I told Trump that if he really wanted to fight terrorism in Africa, the best thing he could do would be to give young Africans a reason to stay home. Give them jobs, give them hope, give them a future worth fighting for. But that requires treating Africa as a partner, not a charity case. It requires respecting our right to develop our own industries, not just extract our resources. And it definitely doesn't include imposing tariffs that could push millions of people into poverty. That's when the conversation took a turn I wasn't expecting. Trump started asking questions, real questions, about our economy, about our industries, about what we actually needed to succeed. For the first time in the conversation, he sounded like he was listening, instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. I told him about the cotton farmers in our central regions, families who've been growing cotton for generations, but who've never been allowed to process it themselves. We ship raw cotton to America, and you sell us back the clothes. I told him about our gold mines, some of the richest deposits in the world, but controlled by foreign companies that take the gold and leave us with holes in the ground. I told him about our young people, the most educated generation in our history, but forced to migrate to Europe because there are no opportunities at home. And I told him the truth that no one in Washington wants to hear. Africa doesn't need charity. We need fairness. We need the right to add value to our own resources. We need trade agreements that benefit both sides, not just one. We need to be treated like partners, not like problems to be managed. That's when Trump said something that surprised me. He said, "What would a fair deal look like?" I wasn't ready for that question. Because for so long, African leaders have been told to be grateful for whatever we get, to accept the deals we're offered and not ask for more. But I've never been that kind of leader, and this was my chance to prove it. I told him that a fair deal would mean eliminating the tariffs that make it impossible for us to compete. It would mean allowing us to process our own resources instead of just exporting them raw. It would mean trade agreements that actually develop African economies instead of just extracting from them. And it would mean respecting our sovereignty. No more aid with strings attached. No more development programs that benefit American companies more than African people. No more treating us like children who can't be trusted to make our own decisions. Trump listened to all of this, and then he asked me a question that really caught me off guard. He said, "Why should I care about any of this?" Not the most diplomatic question, but I appreciated the honesty. I told him that he should care because the alternative is chaos. When African economies fail, the problems don't stay in Africa. They spread. The migration crisis that's tearing Europe apart, that started with economic collapse in countries that couldn't provide for their people. The terrorist groups that threaten global security, they recruit from populations that have lost hope in legitimate opportunities. The drug trafficking networks that move narcotics around the world, they thrive in places where legal economies have failed. All of these problems are connected, and they all trace back to the same source: economic systems that work for some people and destroy others. I told Trump that he could choose to be part of the solution, or he could watch the problems get worse. But he couldn't pretend that Africa's problems wouldn't eventually become America's problems. That's when the conversation really changed. Trump started talking about possibilities instead of limitations, about what Africa could become if we had fair access to global markets, about the opportunities that American businesses were missing by not treating Africa as a real partner. He even started asking about specific sectors where we could expand cooperation: agriculture, technology, manufacturing. For a few minutes, it almost felt like we were having the conversation that Africa and America should have been having for decades. But then reality set in. Trump told me that changing trade policy isn't simple, that there are interests in Washington that benefit from keeping Africa in its current position, that powerful people make money from the status quo, and they don't give up that money easily. I told him I understood all of that, but I also told him something that I hope he remembers. I said, Mr. President, I'm not asking you to be a hero. I'm asking you to be fair. And if you can't be fair, then don't expect us to keep pretending that unfairness is normal. That's when I made it clear that this wasn't just about Burkina Faso. This was about a principle that goes far beyond trade policy. I told him that Africa is done being patient. We're done waiting for the world to decide that we deserve respect. We're done accepting that other people get to determine our future. The days when African leaders would smile and nod while their people suffered are over. At least for me. At least for my country. I told him that if America wants to be our partner, we welcome that. But if America wants to be our master, then we have a problem. And I made it very clear that Burkina Faso is prepared to find other partners if necessary. Partners who treat us as equals. Partners who respect our right to develop our own economy on our own terms. That's when Trump asked me the question that really showed he was starting to understand what this conversation was really about. He said, "What happens if we can't find a solution?" I told him the truth. If America goes ahead with these tariffs, we'll survive. It won't be easy, but we'll survive. We've survived worse. But the relationship between America and Africa will change forever. Because we'll know that when it mattered, when African people needed fairness, America chose profit instead. And that knowledge will shape every decision we make going forward. Every trade agreement, every security cooperation, every diplomatic initiative. Africa will remember who stood with us when we needed partners and who treated us like disposable assets. I told Trump that this moment was bigger than trade policy. It was about whether America wants to be remembered as a country that helped Africa rise, or as a country that tried to keep Africa down. The choice was his. That's when he said something that gave me hope. He said, "Let me look into this. Give me some time to see what's possible." It wasn't a promise, it wasn't a commitment, but it was more than I've gotten from most American leaders, and it was proof that when you speak to power with strength instead of weakness, sometimes power actually listens. But here's what I want you to understand about this conversation. It wasn't really about Trump, and it wasn't really about tariffs. It was about Africa finally saying enough. Enough of being treated like a junior partner in our own development. Enough of watching our resources leave while our people stay poor. Enough of being told to be grateful for scraps while others feast on our wealth. For too long, African leaders have been afraid to speak truth to power, afraid that if we push too hard, we'll lose what little we have. But fear has never built anything worth having, and respect has never been given to those who won't demand it. I'm not afraid of American power. I respect it, but I'm not afraid of it. Because I know something that I think America sometimes forgets. Power without legitimacy is just force, and force without consent